In this lecture, we're going to be adding a test runner so that in the following lectures we can add both unit tests and integration tests to our app. In order to add a test runner, we're going to invoke Node's built-in assertion library, but we're going to have to write the logic for invoking the tests and running through the tests ourselves. Before we do that, it'll be worth creating a very simple function that we can test. So within the helpers library, I'm just going to create a new function called getANumber. So this is going to be a sample for testing that simply returns a number. So helpers.getANumber is going to be a function, and all it's going to do is return the number 1. Now we can create a test runner and some sample unit tests that assert that getANumber should return a number and it should return the number 1. Let's create a directory in our root called test. Now within test, we're going to create a single file called test/index.js. Since it's the index file within the test directory, to invoke it, all we have to call is node test. But we don't need to do that quite yet. Let's go inside of this index.js and start setting up this test runner. We're going to say at the top that this is the test runner. And it is going to have a few dependencies. We know that we're going to need the helpers file because that includes the function getANumber that we're going to need to test. So helpers equals require. Then to get there, we need to go /lib helpers. That is because we need to back out of this test directory and then into the lib directory and then into helpers. The next dependency that we need is the assertion library that I mentioned. So var assert is going to equal require assert. And as you'll see, this assertion library allows us to write very simple syntax that asserts that one thing should equal something else. And if it doesn't equal that, it will create an assertion error. Now we need to create the application logic for the test runner, and then a container for the tests. So the logic holder is just going to be _app, and that's an object. The container for the tests, however, is going to be app.tests. And then within here, we can have as many subkeys as we want. For now, let's just create one subkey called unit, and we'll place all of our unit tests as subkeys on this unit object. Now, even though we haven't written a test runner, let's go ahead and write a few tests first so that we have something that will need to be ran. Let's assert that the getANumber function is returning a number. The way that we're going to structure these unit tests is creating them as keys on this unit object with a name that is human readable. And then they'll each be a function that needs to be invoked. So we are going to say app tests unit, and then we're going to name this test that helpers.getANumber should return 1. It's going to be a function that takes a callback, and we're going to call this callback done. Now that is just a convention that many test runners have used in the past, and it tends to be an easy way to conceptualize what's going on there. When the test is done running, you need to call done. So we're going to say that this value of helpers getANumber should equal 1. For that, we're going to call the assertion library. So we're going to say assert. We want to assert that two things are equal. So assert.equal. We want to assert that val, this return value from getANumber, is equal to 1. So we put val and 1 separated by comma. That's all we need to assert, and we're done asserting it. So now we can call done, which in fact is just a callback as any other, but it's calling done to make this clearer. Now let's copy this And actually, let's make this comment a little clearer down here. We should say that the getANumber function is returning 1. Then up here, we'll write a different one that is returning a number. Should return a number. And we'll get the value as we did before. But now we're going to assert that type of val is equal to number. So first we're asserting that it is a type of number, and now we're asserting that it's 1. Both of these tests should pass. Now let's assert something that isn't true. Let's assert that getANumber function is returning the number 2. We know that these two things are contradictory, so one of them is obviously going to fail, or both. Let's assert that value equals 2, and then call done. Now, at the very bottom of our file, let's say that rather than exporting this module, we want to run the tests. So we're going to call _app.runTests. Now app.runTests doesn't exist. So now let's write this function that is going to figure out a way to call all of these tests and give us an outcome or a report on the outcome. Let's call _app.runTests equals a function. We're going to add a comment here that this is to run all the tests, collecting the errors and successes from those tests. The goal of this function is to run all of the tests and then be able to tell us at the end, 3 of these failed, 2 of them succeeded, and print out a report. So first, let's create an empty array to hold all the errors that might occur. And now let's create a 0 counter, and that is to count the successes that have occurred. We need to know when to stop running the tests, and so we're going to say that the limit is app count tests. Now that isn't a function that exists yet, and so we'll need to write that next, but let's continue on for this for now. This counter of how many tests we've done so far is of course going to be 0, and now we're going to cycle through the tests in app tests. So let's call the for loop for var key in app tests. We need to cycle through all the subkeys and then all the tests within those subkeys. Right now there's only one subkey, that's unit, but in the future there could be many. We want to say that if app tests has own property key, we'll continue looping. So we want to say that var subtests equals app tests at the current key. Now that we have those subtests, we can loop through them. So for var test name in subtests, let's loop through. So if subtests has own property key test name, we can continue. And within here, we're actually going to write a closure. So we're going to say that this is a self-executing function that calls itself at the end. And the purpose of this is just to encapsulate all of these test-specific variables that we are about to define without these nested loops overriding each other's variables. So once we reach actually testing each test, we are going to wrap it in a closure. So we're going to say that var temporary test name equals test name. And then var test value equals subtests test name. So at this point, test value equals the value of these functions. And test name equals the name that we gave to the test. Now we need to call the test. And for that, we're going to wrap it in a try catch, because these assertion errors, if they occur, will likely throw. So we need to catch those throws. And we want to say if it throws, then it failed. So capture the error thrown and log it in red. And we'll do that in a second. But within the try, we want to call test value, which remember contains this function now, because we defined it there. So we're going to call the function test value, and we're going to pass it this callback, which will get invoked with the done. And so we want to say if it calls back without throwing, then it succeeded, because there's no way it would have made it to done if it would have had an assertion fail. So if it calls back without throwing, then it succeeded, so log it in green. So now we have two different outcomes. We have an assertion failing or an assertion passing. Let's fill out what should happen if the assertion passes first. Let's go back to our workers file and copy this console log that we did in yellow, because we're going to need to color this success in green. So we're going to log out the name of the test, which would be a value such as this, and we're going to log it in green. So for this, we want to change 33 to 32. Now we've logged out that it passed, we need to count its success. So we're going to increment the counter. We're going to increment the success counter, so success is ++. Then we're going to say if the counter is equal to the limit, we're done. So we need to call app.produce test report, and we're going to send all this data we've been collecting to the producer of this test report. So we're going to send it the limit, we're going to send it the number of successes, and we're going to send it the array of errors. Now obviously produce test report is another function that doesn't exist yet, and so just like count tests, we're going to have to write that after this one. Now let's handle what should happen if an assertion error fails. So let's say we need to push this error onto this errors array. So we want to call errors.push, and then the thing that we're going to be pushing onto it is actually an object. And that object's going to have two keys, a name, which is the test name, and an error, which is the value of E, which is the error that we caught. Now we want to do something similar to what we did above. We want to log out the test name, but we want to do it in red, so we're going to change 32 to 31. We're going to increment the counter. We're not going to increment the successes because this wasn't a success. And then we're going to have the same if clause. If the counter, now that it's incremented, equals the limit, go ahead and produce the test report with the value of limit, successes, and the errors array. Now, obviously, we need to write these helper functions, or none of this is going to work. So let's do the easy one first. Let's write the count tests function. This is going to be to count all the tests. So we're going to call it app.countTests, and that is a function that doesn't take anything in, and it's just going to need to start a counter and then loop through all of the tests that might be on this unit object or any other subkey and count them up so that we know how many total tests there are. So for var key in app tests, we want to check that it's real. So if app tests has own property key, and it looks like I just have a little typo here, so it's not hash on property, it's has on property. So let me update these. If app tests has on property key, then we'll continue. Again, we're saying that subtests equals app tests key, and then we're going to loop through the subtests once again for var test name in subtests. If subtests has own property test name, then we'll increment the counter. Lastly, when all these loops are done, we want to return the counter. The last thing we have to do is write the function that will produce the test report after this runner completes. We're going to say that that is the function to produce a test outcome report, and that is app produce test report, and as we saw, it is a function that takes in limit, successes, which is a counter, and an array of errors. The first thing it's going to want to do is just create a header, much like we did when we were creating the stats in the command line lectures. but we don't need to do anything that complicated here. Let's just log out an empty line and then a bunch of dashes and say begin test report, a bunch more dashes. Then we want to say that the total tests that were ran are going to equal limit. Then we want to say that the number that have passed, so pass, is going to equal successes. And then fails is going to equal errors.length, because remember it's an array of error objects. Then we can log out another empty line. As with most test runners, we don't just want to list out the errors or have the test names in red, but at the very bottom below this report, we want to list out the error details in detail. If there are errors, print them in detail. So we want to say that if errors.length is greater than 0, then we'll continue. Regardless of if it's greater than 0, at the very end, we want to indicate that we've reached the end of the test report. So we want to console log an empty line, and then console log end test report. But within here, we want to log that we were beginning and ending the printing of error details. Begin error details, and then at the end error details. Now in the middle, we need to loop through the error details and log each one out. We're going to start with an empty line, and we'll actually put an empty line before the end. And in between here, we want to say errors for each, which is going to pass us an object called test error. We want to log out the test error's name, and then the actual exception, and then an empty line. Might as well make it red as we did the other ones. So when we log out the error name, we're going to say, call it test error.name. Now, logging out the whole exception object in red would be a little hard for people to look at, and so let's just log out the exception object in plain. So test error.error, and then a blank line. Okay, so that is a test report, including all the details of any errors that may occur. So to invoke these tests, all we need to do is call node test, because remember that is going to invoke the index file within the test directory. So we call node test, we run the tests, and you see a pretty nice report. We see 2 green lines for helpers. Get a number should return a number, that turned out green. Get a number should return 1, that turned out green. But then get a number should return 2 turned out red. So when we look at our test report, we can see we had 3 tests, 2 of them passed, and 1 of them failed. Then if we want more details about the one that's failed, we know it's going to be this red one here, and we can look down and see, okay, for helpers get a number should return 2, this was the error. We asserted that 1 equals 2, because the return value of get a number was 1, but we asserted that it should equal 2. All the rest of this is just the stack trace telling us how they arrived at this conclusion, but all we really need to know is we expected this to equal 2, and it actually equaled 1. That's the end of the error details and the end of the test report. So that's all the scaffolding that we need in place to be able to run these unit tests. In the next lectures, we'll add on more unit tests so that we can start bulletproofing this application, at least nominally. And then in the lecture after that, we'll add on some integration tests as well. So we can move on to the next lecture.